Well, thank you for that kind introduction. Actually, from the time of Ignatius up until now, there have always been Jesuits working in jail. Actually, there have also been many Jesuits imprisoned in jail. And often this work involved catechesis, counseling, celebrating of the sacraments, especially the Mass. In some cases, there have been one-on-one giving of the spiritual exercises in sort of the 19th annotation mode, which you're familiar with, I'm sure. Several years ago, a few of us began guiding small groups of inmates at county jail here in Chicago through a program, through an adaptation of the spiritual exercises, a 10-week adaptation in small groups of 10, and the program is called Becoming Free on the Inside. Now, you might be wondering, with good reason, why the spiritual exercises? How could a spiritual pedagogy that emerged out of the 16th century be useful for incarcerated people today? Well, as I see it, there are two reasons. One's practical and one is theological. The practical reason is that the spiritual exercises offers a set of concrete practices that places a person on a pathway towards self-knowledge, a self-knowledge that leads to inner freedom. One quickly discovers, if one journeys on that pathway, that freedom involves much more than the absence of physical confinement. It's no longer simply a matter of how soon can I get out of jail, but even more importantly, how free will I be when I get out of jail? Once a person arrives at that insight, it seems to me the implication becomes self-evident. Why not use this jail time to become interiorly free? Hence the name of the program, Becoming Free on the Inside. The theological reason for doing the spiritual exercises in jail is simply we try to help people come to a more liberating image of God. I think many of the inmates walk around with an inner narrative of a God who's not only distant, but often deeply disappointed with them. A God who keeps track of all the times that we fail to measure up. Such a God becomes kind of a 24-hour interrogation lamp. I think it was Meister Eckhart who wondered, how long will men and women keep drawing in their minds images of God that make them sad? So slowly but surely, the folks who participate in this program that we do in jail begin to recognize the divine presence within. And as you know, this kind of revelation can be truly freeing and empowering. We often begin with the quote from Rumi, I sought God in church and couldn't find God there. I sought God in the synagogue, couldn't find God there. I sought God in my mosque, couldn't find that. But I finally sought God in myself and found God there. Something similar happened, by the way, to Ignatius Loyola, right? He, I think before his conversion was not simply a moral conversion, even though it's sometimes framed that way. Ignatius really underwent a spiritual transformation. He came to know a God who was nearer to him than he was to himself. And anyone who makes the spiritual exercises, I think, undergoes a similar process. Discovered how, from the very beginning, his or her life has been anchored in God. And that makes all the difference. So those are the two main reasons we began this work. And this program is abbreviated, as I mentioned at the beginning, a very abbreviated adaptation of the spiritual exercises. It lasts for only 10 weeks. With just 2 hour meeting, 1 2 hour meeting a week in a group of about 10. So in many ways, it's not as nearly as rich as the spiritual exercises, since the full spiritual exercises are, But it has a methodology that's very dialogical, very participatory, and it's adapted to the limiting conditions of the jail. It strives, I would say, it strives to help the people making the exercises there in jail to experience this time, not just as a punishment and a drudgery, but in Ignatian terms, as a cannonball experience. And by undergoing this process together, they create a small support group within their tier or pod within the jail, which is also very, very important. So then we begin the retreat, and we go through the 4 weeks of the exercises, beginning, of course, with what Ignatius calls the principle and foundation. We simply call it the foundation, which is basically inviting the retreatants to come to the insight of how important it is to have an inner GPS, an existential need for an inner compass in their lives. Where am I right now? Where am I headed? Where have I come from? Once a person gets those existential coordinates, then he or she is ready to make the exercises. And we help guide that process by meditating on a few scripture texts like Psalm 138, 39, or Jeremiah 18, which speaks about God as a potter. I think the challenge at the beginning of the retreat is for each of the inmates to find what Jesus would call an inner room, because as you can imagine, the jail tends to be a very noisy place. And so it takes a while for them to find a space in the jail and in their schedule when they can actually have some quiet time, some time for prayer. So essential, really, for interior growth. In our prayer, of course, as we pray, we begin every session with prayer. Our prayer, the grace that we ask for is always to somehow lean into this great mystery that is God and begin to find traces of God in creation, in ourselves, in our own lives, in the world around us. And we give them a journal so that they begin to notice God's presence. This is a journal that we give them. It's called a gratitude journal, a 1-minute gratitude journal. And so we have them right from the beginning to practice the first part of the Ignatian examen, or the Ignatian awareness pause, right? Where they simply put the day of the week and they write down at the end of the day or whenever they make the examen some of the gifts that they've received, some of the traces that they've noticed of this gifting God in their lives. And we encourage them to do that every single day, based on the conviction, the Ignatian conviction, that really gratitude is the mother of all virtues. A grateful person will tend to be a happy person, a hopeful person, a generous person, humble person. Whereas the opposite is also true, right? The ungrateful person will tend to be sad, will tend to be stingy, will tend to be proud because he or she thinks that everything they have is because they're so wonderful. So I think that's a very transformative prayer and a transformative exercise. We make the point right at the beginning that this retreat is really about exercises. They all know what physical exercise is. They have a gym in each one of the pods, so that they know exactly what it is to do push-ups or to play sports. So we try to say, well, now what spiritual exercises are you doing? And we talk about them and we share our experience. And they begin to learn spiritual exercises and how important it is to have those structured throughout the day. So then once that's the beginning of the exercises, that's how we begin. Then moving slowly into this first week, we begin to look at the reality of brokenness, their own brokenness and the brokenness in our world, and the need for healing. We encourage the participants to ask for the grace to recognize, first of all, the seeds that God has planted within each one of them, the good seeds that God has planted in each one of them, and how each of us are born to manifest the goodness of God. And then once they've kind of completed an inventory of those gifts, then on the right-hand column, to slowly consider, well, which gifts have I used well? Which gifts have I lost sight of, perhaps? Which gifts got trampled upon by surrounding circumstances? Which gifts have I wasted or used simply for myself? And we ask them to kind of talk to God about this history of gifts used and gifts wasted or gifts ignored. And then what gifts remain undeveloped or got squashed but could be redeemed. As the participants wrestle with this question, and it is kind of a complex question, they begin to appreciate the reality of sin in their lives, in their own lives, in the circumstances around them, in our world. And to sort of talk with God about that compositum, that mixed bag that we all are and that our world is. But we're always emphasizing that grace is stronger than sin, even though there's definitely sin in our own lives and in our world. Our world is permeated with grace. We invite them to pray, to spend some time with Romans 7, to consider the experience that St. Paul had, which finds an echo in each of our lives. Name the times when you've had that struggle, you've known what you should do, and you did the opposite, or you did something else. We ask them to struggle, to ponder those moments, to think about them, to wonder how they happened. And we ask them to pray Psalm 51 and to make it their own, to put it in their own words. And we try to make it clear that sin is not just a list of things we've done wrong, but kind of an abuse of freedom. We stress this liberating God liberates us, wants us to live in freedom. Our aim then is not to sort of drown the participants in paralyzing guilt, but to appreciate how any person's life can become disordered by a false understanding of self, a false understanding of freedom. And we reflect upon how very often sin presents itself as something good, as something attractive. And in the process, the participants begin to appreciate the importance of discernment, how we need to become discerning individuals in our lives. Discernment isn't something that should be reserved for occasional annual moments, but something that really has to be woven into the fabric of our lives. Precisely because sin is often, has to do with blindness, has to do with not seeing well. Sin has to do with forgetfulness. Sin has to do with kind of a paralysis sometimes. And so we make these points that sin does not necessarily just involve making a list of the things we've done wrong, but we try to also help them see the opportunities that were missed. Sins of omission are also very important, and probably the most important thing in each of our lives. So to begin to think of opportunities missed and how we could in the future take a better advantage of those opportunities to radiate God's love through our actions. At this point, we give this is like moving into about the third or fourth week of the experience. We give the participants this other journal. So again, it's a lot of exercises. We give them homework, so to speak. And this is called 70 times 7. I think so in other words, we ask them to make a list of the people that they want to forgive, the list of the people who needs to forgive them, in other words, to basically reflect on their lives and to realize that every person, every family, every university, every country needs a little mercy. And that our world would be much better if we learned to radiate a demanding mercy, perhaps, but a true mercy as opposed to revenge. And so we spend a couple of weeks kind of pondering that, and we try to ask them to become as concrete as possible, to identify people they need to forgive. Could be a parent. Often it's a parent who was absent when they were born, wasn't around enough, a parent who was on drugs. Some of them have very, very difficult pasts, and they need to kind of, if they don't forgive those folks, or in some ways at least understand what was going on there, they will carry around, as I say, these suitcases full of bad memories and anger, and that only hurts themselves. And then finally, we invite them to meditate upon, at the end of this first week, we invite them to meditate upon certain parables of Jesus, the lost sheep, the father with the two sons, the unforgiving servant. I'm sure you're familiar with those parables. Most of these participants have heard those parables before, but we encourage them to ponder them more deeply and to make them their own, so that they kind of take flesh, so to speak, in each of their lives. And we pray for the grace to experience God as extravagant mercy, as opposed to a judge, which they've had experience with. So how can we come to know God as a source of mercy, and then can we become a source of mercy ourselves in our world? And we help them to appreciate that those two things are connected. To the extent that we experience God as mercy, to that extent, we're likely to radiate mercy in our own lives. Nearly everyone has wronged somebody at some point in their lives. Who among us has not longed to be forgiven? I think nearly everyone's experienced some sort of injustice or wrongdoing. And we've all struggled and how we should forgive or when we should forgive. So we start discussing forgiveness as a grace, not just as an abstract idea, but as a grace that we want to pray for and ask for. An experience that we all need to have. A virtue that we want to practice. And so gradually we move into the next moment of the exercises, and we begin to meditate on the life of Jesus. And usually there we begin with in place of what's called the kingdom meditation, we usually read the Beatitudes. And we suggest that this is what Jesus is calling us to. This is Jesus's plan. This is Jesus's program. And he invites us to be a part of it. The fact that we've made some mistakes in the past doesn't keep us from being eligible candidates for this program. So we meditate. Here we begin to teach them the contemplative prayer, Ignatian contemplative prayer. So we don't just meditate on the Beatitudes in the abstract, but we ask them to imagine yourself, Jesus spoke to the crowds there, and then he moved up to the mountain and he invited his closest disciples to come up. So we ask them to imagine yourself being invited up by Jesus, and Jesus makes these 8 blessings over you, each blessing being one of the Beatitudes, each blessing being an empowerment, which is what grace is really, right? So Jesus is empowering us to live, to practice the Beatitudes. And that can be very transforming when they experience that. and they experience that they're called to something very all different. Here's where we enter. We talk a little bit about, I think it was Carl Rogers, who was the first one to talk about the first half of life and the second half of life. David Brooks, in one of his books, he talks about that. Well, obviously, most of the folks in the program where I've been working in Division 9 and Division 11 are usually in their 30s. So it's mid-30s. So it's a good time for them to start thinking about the first half and second half of life. And admittedly, they've made some serious mistakes in the first half of life, but it's not too late. It's not over. They could still they could sign on to the Plan B, Plan Beatitudes for the second half of their life if they want to. That's the invitation. They're being invited to by Christ to do so. We make the distinction between admirers of Christ and followers of Christ, or admirers of Christ, mere admirers on the sidelines, and active disciples. We mentioned Jesus has billions of admirers, but a much smaller group of disciples. That is to say, people that are really willing to sign on to these Beatitudes and make the Beatitudes part of their lives. And that's the invitation for them. So you gradually move into what Ignatius calls in the exercises the two standards. The standard of upward mobility and the standard of downward mobility. That the true disciple is willing to undergo poverty and humiliation in order to follow Christ more closely. We often invite them to think about, to pray over the good parable of the Good Samaritan. That proves to be a good parable to reflect upon. It's easy to step into that parable, to imagine yourself as one of the people walking down the road there, and to consider who really, of all the actors in that parable, who was the one that knew how to become neighbor, the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan. And probably, as Pope Francis says in Fratelli Tutti, we've probably all been different characters in that at different times in our lives. Sometimes we've been the guy who walked by, the person in the ditch. Sometimes we have been the person that responded well. But anyway, we invite them to consider that. And it's interesting how Jesus is always asking questions of his disciples. I think during the retreat, or during this 10-week process, they come to appreciate Jesus who's always asking questions. What can I do for you? The question that Jesus asked Bartimaeus. Well, we have the disciples, or the inmates, consider Jesus asking that question of them. And then finally, the most important question, of course, is when Jesus asked, I think it's about 50 questions in each one of the 4 Gospels. But the question that's most important is the question, who do you say that I am? And he clearly wasn't looking for a theological answer so much at that point, or a theoretical answer, I should say, but rather a personal existential response. Who am I for you? And of course, Jesus had already was announcing that the cross was part of discipleship. So that question becomes a very important question, and not an easy question to answer. So you gradually start moving into the 3rd week of the exercises as Jesus draws nearer to the cross. By the way, we spent some time, we invite all of the inmates into the Last Supper to imagine themselves around the table at the Last Supper. We ask them to imagine themselves sitting there with the other disciples, what it means to be a community of disciples as opposed to isolated individuals. And then what does it mean how do you feel when Jesus starts washing your feet? And why do you think he did that? What's the point of that exercise? Why would Jesus become a servant to his very own disciples. And so we talk a lot about servant leadership and all of that. We discuss the difference between the prosperity gospel and the prophetic gospel. And then we spend some time reflecting on the fact that Jesus went to jail, which, as you could imagine, has a special meaning for these men and women. We ask, why would somebody follow? Why wouldn't you follow somebody who was arrested, but arrested for doing good for others, arrested for speaking the truth, arrested for challenging the status quo? We reflect on how Jesus practiced faithfulness as a way of life. And we ask if we're capable of practicing faithfulness as a way of life. Faithfulness to the voice of God who said, "You are my beloved," how Jesus held on to that voice. By the way, earlier on, we've reflected on Jesus's contemplative practice, how Jesus got up in the morning to pray. At night, he prayed. Even after a busy day, Jesus would spend time reflecting, meditating, contemplating, anchoring himself in this boundless love of God, and how important it is for us to do the same thing. And gradually, some of them, not all of them maybe, but in some to a different extent, they all, I think, begin to experience the transformative power of prayer. And then, of course, we ask them to reflect on the question that Jesus asked after he washed their feet. Do you realize what I have done for you? Do you realize what I have done for you? And then we ask them to go into the Garden of Gethsemane with Jesus. So you can see by the third week, we're definitely engaging in contemplative prayer. Even during the second and third week, we do a lot of contemplative prayer. They learn to do that. And it's really beautiful. And again, to think of the question of Jesus, are you not willing to spend an hour in prayer with me? It's a powerful question. Are you not willing to pray even 1 hour with me? Then we ask them to choose. We have a little book with the Stations of the Cross, and we ask them just to choose one of the stations and to spend one or two of the stations and to spend maybe a half hour at each. It could be in their cell, or wherever they have found quiet in this noisy jail. I mean, heaven help us. The hardest part, the people who learn to pray in jail, I think, become real mystics, because it's not like making the retreat at a nice retreat house that looks out on the ocean. This is really, you're learning to pray in a room where there's like 5 televisions going on at the same time, where there's shouting, where there's clanging of the cell doors, etc. Then, as we move into the fourth week, we invite them to join with the disciples, with the other disciples, in the cenacle with Mary, praying, and to recognize, their fear, their doubts, their confusion after Jesus died, to feel that, to sense that, to identify that feeling in themselves, but to learn to wait. We often use that quote of Teilhard de Chardin, trust in the slow work of God. So as they wait, then eventually, Jesus shows up and says, the risen Christ, and doesn't come up, doesn't bawl them out for their poor performance during the Passion, but says, peace be with you, and reiterates that promise several times, making an important point that we need to have that peace in every cell of our body if we want to really be about his work. And we focus on one of the chapters of Acts, I think it's chapter 1, right? Where you can see the transformation that took place in the first disciples. Peter's standing up there and he's got the other disciples behind him. And he's talking very courageously, very boldly, as Acts of the Apostles describes it, to this very diverse audience there. And everyone's literally blown away by this radical transformation that took place in these disciples. Remember, just a few days before, or a few weeks before, these very same disciples were fearful, disunited, fighting among themselves, fearful, and now they've become clear, courageous, and unified. So how do you explain that? I think when you witness that transformation that took place in those first disciples, I think that's the best argument for the resurrection. Maybe even more important than the empty tomb. It's just so important. There's no other way to explain this amazing transformation that took place in these first disciples. It's interesting to note, by the way, that these disciples who had something to do with the composing of the Gospels, they didn't Photoshop anything in. They didn't make themselves look better than they were. It's pretty clear reading the Gospels that they were a kind of a motley group at first. And yet they underwent this amazing transformation at the resurrection. And then we have them reflect on some of these Pauline texts. We often think of Paul as a community organizer, which of course he was, which is important. But he was also kind of a mystic. Just read this one phrase I have here. It says, "We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God, not from ourselves. We're pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry in our body the death of Jesus, but so that the life of Christ may also be revealed in our bodies. For while we're alive, we're always given over to death for Jesus' sake, but so that the life of Christ may be revealed in our mortal bodies. So that while death is at work in us, life is also at work. So learning to experience Easter and Pentecost, not as in past tense, but as like present perfect tense, becomes very significant transformation for them, because most of them, like often most of us, we tend to think of Pentecost or even Easter as being an event in the past and not an ongoing reality. I think just a little footnote, I think liturgically speaking, I think that's probably our weakest. We do a fairly decent job with Lent, with the ashes and with our sacrifices and all during Lent, in order to grow closer to join in share in the cross of Christ. And we do something during Advent. The church fosters certain contemplative practices that I think help us overcome kind of the consumerism that permeates our world at the time. But one thing we really haven't done adequately, it seems to me, is Eastertide. Eastertide is 50 days, and we tend to, I think with notable exceptions, we tend not to celebrate those 50 days as fully as we should. Like I was just at a parish this weekend, and we talked about resurrection stories. We had everyone share a resurrection stories. And that's what we need to do. That's what we invite the men to do in jail too. I say men because I'm working now with a group of men. Ask them to identify resurrection stories that they've experienced in their own lives, or in the lives of their family members, or in the lives of their friends or their fellow cellmates. It's once you begin to identify resurrection stories, it becomes easier and easier to do so all along. And then you begin to realize that, I think I'm going to pay more attention to resurrection stories than to the bad news that surrounds us. because if you get sucked into focusing mostly on the bad news, that bad news eventually colonizes your mind and your heart. Whereas if you remain attentive to the good news, that's always bubbling up from below, and there's always more good news than bad news. But we have to become attuned to it. It takes a little bit of fine tuning to do it. But once you do, then you never let go of it because it's so life-giving, as opposed to the bad news, which tends to be defeating and draining. So, and in all of this, we talk a little bit about, I remind them of the saints that were, of holy persons that were in jail, of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, reminding them that jail was not an impediment for these folks, but actually helped them to deepen their faith. And we say, so we don't want to mystify the notion of sainthood or holiness. And that being in jail doesn't mean that this time in jail doesn't have to be a distraction from holiness, but it could be a very important chapter on their way to holiness, which is our common vocation, the kind of holy men and women that our world needs today. So that's just in brief. But now feel free to ask questions, or if that doesn't make any sense, or to voice disagreement too. This is just kind of a very brief summary I should just add, summary of a limited experience. We've only done this for about 2 years. It's still too early. In the Jesuits, we talk a lot about experiments. We have experiments in the novitiate. Everything's an experiment, which I think is very Ignatian. You try something first for a while, you experiment with it, and then you evaluate it. In other words, you don't make something into an institution too quickly. So as far as I'm concerned, we're still not settled about this. On this, we're experimenting with this program, becoming free on the inside. Thanks for listening. Thanks.